Seemingly after the 12 apostles are sent out for a time and return, we think the end of Jesus' second year of ministry comes to an end. Going into his third year of ministry, we begin with the feeding of the 5,000, followed by the event of Jesus walking on water, the healings at Gennesraet, the teachings on being the bread of life, the disciples falling away, and the defilement of man. But we will first cover the events of the feeding of the 5,000. At some point when the Passover was near, Jesus departs over the Sea of Galilee, to a deserted place. The people who saw him leaving even came out from the cities and began to follow him by foot. Having seen his miracles he performed on those who were diseased. The people arrive to the place even before Jesus does, and going up the mountain to sit with his disciples, he sees the multitudes and is moved with compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. He then begins to teach them and heal those who were sick. Then turning to Philip, Jesus asks him how they can buy enough bread to feed the crowd. This was to test Philip since Jesus knew what he was going to do. Philip replies that not even half a year's wages would be enough to buy a little for each person. At this point the disciples asked Jesus to dismiss the crowds and send them away, since the place they were in was deserted and it was getting late. They would be able to go acquire food in the local areas and also find lodging. Jesus replies to them that they do not need to leave, telling them they should give them food to eat. Andrew informs Jesus that there is a boy with them who has 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. But what is that among so many people, unless they go and buy more food? Jesus then asks for the bread and fish to be brought to him. Commanding the disciples to have the people sit in groups of 50, the people did so in the grass, and they numbered 5,000 plus the women and children. Taking the bread and fish, he looks up to heaven, blessing, breaking, and giving thanks. He gives the food to the disciples to distribute among the crowds. The multitude then ate and were all filled, Jesus then commanding the disciples to gather the remaining fragments so that nothing remains, and the disciples gathered and filled up 12 baskets full of leftovers. This caused those who were with Jesus to profess him as the prophet. The Gospel of John informs us that in response to this the people wanted to make Jesus king by force. Perceiving this, Jesus dismisses the crowds and instructs the disciples to go before him and take the ship over to Bethsaida toward Capernaum. Jesus then departs by himself to the mountain to pray, staying there until the evening while the disciples go down to the sea and leave. When night had arrived, the ship carrying the disciples was in the middle of the sea when a great wind began to blow and the disciples began to toil in their rowing. Jesus standing on the land and seeing them. In the midst of their rowing, Jesus comes near the ship walking on the water, and it seems he would have even passed by them. The disciples, noticing Jesus walking on the sea, thought it was a spirit and began to cry out in fear. Jesus begins to speak to them, telling them not to be afraid, but to be of good cheer. Entering the ship, the wind ceases and they immediately arrive on land, the disciples being amazed and in wonder, not considering the miracles of the loaves and fish they had just witnessed because their hearts were hardened. Coming over to the land of Gennesraet, the people knew who he was, and sending out others in the region the people brought all those who were diseased, carrying them on beds. And whenever Jesus would enter a village, city, or country, the people would lay the sick in the street as they sought to touch even the hem of his garment, and those who touched him were healed. Seemingly after this, the people standing on the other side of the sea noticed that there was no other boats except the one the disciples had used, and they noticed that Jesus did not enter the boat but that the disciples had gone off alone. When they realized Jesus and his disciples were not there, they took ships and sailed to Capernaum seeking Jesus. Apparently finding him in the synagogue, they called Jesus Rabbi and asked him when he arrived there. Answering them, Jesus tells them they sought him because they ate of the bread he had given and they were filled. They did not seek him because of the miracles. Taking the time to instruct them, he declares to them not to labor for food that perishes, but rather for food that will last for everlasting life which the Son of Man will give them, because it is he whom the Father has sealed. Questioning Jesus, they ask what they can do to work for God, and in reply Jesus tells them that the work of God is to believe in him who has been sent. The people then ask what sign he will give them, and refer to God giving them manna from heaven in the desert as a sign. Jesus replies by telling them that Moses did not give them bread from heaven, but his Father gives them true bread from heaven, and that this true bread from God is he which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. The people then ask Jesus for this bread, and in reply Jesus tells them that he is that bread of life, and that whoever comes to him shall never hunger, and whoever believes on him shall never thirst. Yet, they have seen him and did not believe. Continuing, he teaches them that all those who the Father gives him will come to him, and he will not cast them out, and that he came down from heaven to do the will of the Father, not his own will, the Father sending him. that his Father's will is that he lose nothing he has given to the Son, but that he should raise it up on the last day, this being the will of the Father who sent him, that those who see the Son and believe on him may have everlasting life, and Jesus will raise him up on the last day. In response, the Jews began to complain about him for claiming to be the bread of life which came down from heaven, saying, "Isn't this Jesus the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he say he came from heaven?" Jesus responds by telling them not to murmur among themselves, that no one can come to him unless the Father who sent him draws them, and the Father will raise him on the last day. Referring to the prophets, Jesus tells them the prophets wrote that they would all be taught by God, and that those who have heard and learned from the Father will come to him. That no one has seen the Father except the one who is from God, and those who believe on him have everlasting life. Continuing with his teaching, Jesus declares that he is the bread of life, and that their fathers ate manna in the desert and yet still died. Yet he is the living bread which came down from heaven, in which a man may eat and not die. Jesus declares the bread he gives is his flesh, which he will give to the life of the world. This was apparently too much for the Jews to take, and they begin to complain about him, asking how he could give his flesh to eat. Jesus then tells them that unless they eat his flesh and drink his blood, they have no life in them. But for those who eat his flesh and drink his blood, they will have eternal life, and he will raise them on the last day. For his flesh is meat and his blood is drink. Therefore those who eat and drink in his flesh and blood will dwell in him, and he in them. As the living Father sent Jesus, and he lives by the Father, so the one who eats of him shall also live by him. He is the bread from heaven. Not as their fathers ate manna and died, but those who eat this bread will live forever. This deep teaching was apparently too much, even for many of the disciples who followed Jesus, as even many of them complained that this message was too difficult to be heard. Jesus, understanding their complaint, then speaks to them and asks if this teaching offends them. And what if they see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? He then claims that it is the Spirit who gives life, the flesh does not profit anything, and his words are spirit and life. He then points out that there were some of them who did not believe, he knowing from the beginning who they were and also who would betray him. Continuing, he declares to them that no one can come to him unless it is given to them by the Father. It is here that we get from John's Gospel that many of his disciples stop following him and go back. Turning to the 12 apostles, he asks them if they also will leave him. And Peter responds that he, Jesus, has the words of everlasting life. Where shall they go? That they believe and are assured he is the Christ, Son of the living God. Jesus then answers them by stating he has chosen them, and yet one of them is a devil. This was in reference to Judas Iscariot, who would later betray him. As Jesus continued to minister openly during his 3rd year, there comes a time when some of the Pharisees and scribes from Jerusalem came together to speak to him. They accuse his disciples of transgressing the law because they had observed the disciples eating bread without washing their hands, asking Jesus why his disciples do not keep the traditions of the elders. This was in reference to the Pharisees and Jews who washed their hands before eating, in keeping with traditions. They had a tradition in which they would not eat unless they washed their hands, and also had other traditions of washing, such as the washing of cups, pots, vessels, and tables. Jesus replies by asking them why they transgress the command of God by their own tradition, stating that God commanded that father and mother were to be honored, as Moses proclaimed, and that whoever curses their parents shall die. However, they say that whatever gift parents might have gained and profited from their children is considered korban, or devoted to God. They no longer allow their parents to be honored and are free from transgression, therefore making the command of God of no effect. By way of their traditions, Jesus then calls them hypocrites, and refers to Isaiah prophesying about them as those who draw near to God with their mouths and honor him with their lips, but their hearts being far from him, as they worship God in vain, teaching the commandments of men as doctrine, laying aside the commands of God for the traditions and fully rejecting God's commands. Calling on the multitude who were present, Jesus tells them to hear and understand, that what a man eats does not defile him, but rather it is what comes out of a man which defiles him, and that whoever has ears to hear should hear. Leaving and later entering a house, the disciples come to Jesus and ask if he knew he offended the Pharisees. Jesus replies by telling them that those plants which have not been planted by the Father will be uprooted. Leave the Pharisees alone, they are blind leading the blind. And if the blind lead the blind, they will both fall into a ditch. Peter and the disciples then ask Jesus to explain the parable he just taught to the multitude. Jesus asks them if they are also without understanding, and if they do not yet understand. He then explains that whatever enters a man cannot defile him, because it does not enter his heart, but goes through his stomach and is cast out. Rather, it is what comes out of a man which defiles him, because what proceeds from the mouth comes from the heart and defiles a man. Jesus then lists what these defilements are: evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, and foolishness. These are what defile a man, not with eating with unwashed hands, for what comes from within defiles a man. And with that we will end this portion of our survey lecture with this teaching. So, in review, we observed what we think is the beginning of Jesus' third year of ministry, beginning with the feeding of the 5,000, followed by the event of Jesus walking on water, the healings at Gennesraet, the teachings on being the bread of life, the disciples falling away, and the defilement of man. In our next lecture we will continue on the third year of Jesus' ministry as we observe the chronological events regarding the healings of many people, as well as the feeding of the 4,000.